Welcome back to Ladies in Law. I'm Michaela.
And I'm Allison.
And this is a podcast where we talk about making the law digestible, curating an authentic network, and also what it's like being a female attorney in a heavily dominated male field. And speaking of that last one, that's what we're going to dive into today.
Yes. So let's get honest. I think we've been wanting to talk about this for a while, and we just want to talk about examples of things that we've experienced and that might resonate with some of the listeners on experiences being a female attorney and what that's like. And
Absolutely.
So, Michaela, I know you and I have talked about it a lot, but what are some examples of things that maybe you've seen just in your day-to-day, things that you've come across where you're like, oh, this does not feel great.
Not the a good amount of examples come to my brain, and I think it's important. Like you and I have talked about this in terms of like we never want to sound whiny,
Of course.
but also these are our experiences, and we think it's important to share our experiences for the next generation of female attorneys that are coming about in this field.
Especially so you don't feel alone and like, am I crazy? Is this just me?
No,
Do they hate me?
Yeah, and I'm like, am I reading too much into this? Like, am I putting too much weight on this? It's so good to just kind of have that validation that like, well, it doesn't feel good to be validated when you aren't being treated like respectfully, but it's good to know you're not alone.
Yes, I agree.
So I think like one of the first examples that come to my brain when I'm a handling attorney, and I am the one, emailing, calling, meeting and conferring.
Sending discovery.
Doing
Doing depo.
Exactly. It's like my name on this, like you're seeing all the time. But then an email from opposing counsel still being directed to a male attorney that's on my team. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, well, I'm the handling one. Like, that I'm the one that just emailed you that question. It says my name. It says that I'm an attorney underneath my name. Like you see that, but you still reply all and don't address me.
Yeah.
I think that one is one that happens probably most frequently.
Yeah.
And then, showing up for a deposition and it being like, okay, is the attorney showing up? And it's like, yes, I'm sitting right here. And I am
been on all the correspondence, but yes, okay.
Yeah, those are I think the ones that I encounter the most.
Yeah.
And while it might seem minuscule or tiny in the grand scheme of things, it's one other thing where you kind of just feel like you're being forgotten or not taken seriously, or like why don't you respect me enough to just address me when I'm the one asking you this question?
And I think sometimes it kind of overlaps. It's not just because you're a female attorney. I think it's also sometimes age.
For sure.
And I've also experienced that where I hop on a Zoom and obviously I'm Hispanic, so they'll be like, oh, are you the interpreter? And I'm like, no. Did you look at the proof of service or like the master caption? Mm-hmm. And my name's on there and everything. So it's just like those little jabs. And I think 90% of the time I kind of just let it slide, but sometimes you've had a day and it's just like one thing after the next and you're just like, oh my gosh, again?
Yeah.
And I think it's nice to be able to vent to someone, especially, I know like I rely on you a lot, and it's nice to have someone that we work together, and so we're very familiar with everything, but also sometimes friends outside of the law and that don't know this world, because sometimes they get it a little bit more.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes people, I've had female attorneys that'll just be like, oh, that always happens. And I'm like, yeah, but we can't just dismiss it.
Because it'll continue to happen.
Yeah.
And also, like, it's hard not to internalize when you see something continuously. It's hard to not be like, is it me? Like, am I not demanding it? Is it because of X? Is it because of Y? Like, how can I show up and assert myself, but also still authentically be me? Like, I love to put exclamation points in my emails.
Me too.
I love to just be like, have a great day. Like, I hope you have a nice weekend, because like we're humans at the end of the day.
Yeah.
But I also don't want that to be a pass for someone to think that I can be taken advantage of or not taken as seriously.
Yeah.
And I think that's like this balance that we're constantly having to juggle.
Yes. And I think for me too, like, and every time I hop on a deposition, I usually go on like 5 minutes before and I'm talking to everyone like, how's everyone's weekend? Like that's just me. And I know even if defense counsel is there, I'm like, how was your weekend? And I try to just be myself. And I know that they have a job to do and I respect their job, but I also don't think it has to be aggressive.
Yeah.
And so for me, it's always just been like, that's just who I am. And so it does bother me when you get those attorneys that will treat you differently because you are younger or a female attorney. And I will just straight up put it on I'll just be like, oh no, like I am the attorney for the record and kind of just make them feel awkward because I know that sometimes when I've hopped on and I genuinely don't know who's who, like there's like 5 different screens, different people involved in a case. And sometimes they're just shadowing or whatever. I'll just politely ask like, oh, Mr. blah, blah, blah. Who do you represent or what's your role? Are you sitting in? But I think when you get a question asked versus just being like, oh, are you the court reporter or are you the interpreter? It comes off very differently. So I think people need to be really cognizant of the language they use because it affects us for sure.
Absolutely. And I was going to say, like, I think we can talk about kind of like how we can combat this or like what we do when these things happen or how we can try and maybe show how change can happen in those kinds of ways. And you totally just touched on that with how you approach it, where you don't want to sit there, you don't want to pass judgment, you don't want to assume you know who everybody is. Like there are ways to switch our rhetoric and the phrasing by being like, oh, can everyone state their name and their relationship to this case?
Yeah.
You know, or like, is everyone that we're waiting for here? I'd like to have everyone kind of say their role.
Yeah.
You know, there are ways to do it where you're not assuming you know what each person shows up as.
And I appreciate so much whenever I log on and, you know, you have the court reporter that has their screen, like I am the court reporter.
Yes.
It's like, or even sometimes the videographer will be like, I'm the videographer. I see that we have plaintiff's counsel. And I'm like, that's it. So I think there's so many little ways that you can kind of rely on others to help you, but also just asserting yourself and like being assertive, like I am the attorney. And just kind of like making sure that the person that's directing that negative energy towards you, like that you show them that it didn't affect me. Like I'm just going to brush it off. I'm the attorney and let's go. Like, let's move with this case. But I think sometimes you do, like if you're having a bad day, all those things just, they add up and you're like, oh my God, I just want to vent to someone.
Yes, exactly. And in this profession, like a lot of things can easily add up, but I think that's true in almost every profession. And I know us being in a heavily dominated male field is also not isolated to just the practice of law.
Yeah.
And I think also like that first example that I gave, where I'm the handling attorney, I'm sending these emails and it's still directed towards the male attorney. Like a way that male attorney has like stood up and shown up for me and been an ally in that sense and seen what was happening is by responding and very respectfully just being like, hi, thank you for your response. I want to direct you to the handling attorney, Michaela, who you have already seen on these emails, you know, where it's like, it's a very kind way of being like, hey, like I see what you're doing. And also like, this is our female attorney that you should respect and like direct your inquiries or responses to. So there are ways that like we can have people show up for us too, where it doesn't have to always kind of be us on the defense.
Exactly. And I think having those allies also just point out like, this is the attorney that's been working up the case. She would have a better response for you. Like, I don't really know. And being like honest about that too, because I think sometimes it does kind of get, the ghosting like really gets annoying. But then also like once that male attorney responds and you seeing like an immediate response to that, it's like, come on.
Yeah.
So I think having those allies and being able to count on your team as well.
Absolutely.
Because I think when your team notices it as well, it validates you and you're like, okay, it's not just me that feels like they're ghosting me and they're doing all these things. So I agree. I think it helps. I also wanted to talk about in depositions, and I don't remember where someone said this on, I think, Instagram, but put everything on the record. And I always tell very young attorneys to do this. Like if it's your first deposition, and the other side's harassing you, and put that on the record. Don't go off the record. You have to both agree to go off the record. And if they're saying things or they're name calling or getting like really aggressive, like this is obviously getting to like another level, have that on the record. I had one of my friends that just horrible things were said to her and she went off the record, and then thankfully she had the foresight, but she put everything back on the record, and she was like, I just want the record to reflect we were off the record and XXX was said to me, and I'm proceeding with this deposition, but I want it to be very clear, like I am a member of the California bar and I deserve the professional respect and courtesy that's given to other members of the bar. Damn. And I was just like, amazing. That's so good. But it's just sad that those experiences are out there. And so I think just a good practice pointer is don't like back down and end your deposition early. No, like put that on the record, get through your deposition and stand strong for sure.
Absolutely. I think a lot of the time we are placed in the position of having to prove that we deserve to be where we're at. And I think that can be so difficult when you don't feel like you can just show up. Like you have to show up and show why you're smart enough and show why you're capable enough. And it's like, we all took the same bar exam. We all, like have to go through the same steps to be where we're at. And so like our journey to get there is no less than anybody else's. But I think that we are a lot of the time feel like we have to prove ourselves, that we deserve to be in this space. And I think that is difficult when you still want to authentically show up as yourself and not become jaded and not become rough around the edges because you're preempting what you think someone might, think about you or treat you.
I love that. And I think one thing I try to do is, especially, when you're going into a case, the best thing you can do is just be very well prepared, know the case law. And that way, when you do encounter something, if you support your stance with case law and facts, you can set the emotions aside. And obviously, you can feel those later on. But I think it just gives you that credibility. Like, I know that sometimes in depositions, I've had to bring out case law. And I have it in my little outline and, like, in the footer. Like, okay, this case said this.
That's amazing.
But I had a deposition where the defense attorney pulled up the case and was like, counsel, he made an objection and he's like, counsel, do you want to read the case? And I was like, I've read that case. My position's not changing and I'm not allowing my client to answer. So let's move on with the deposition and your questioning. And it just was so condescending though, the way he like pulled up the case. I was like, we can go off the record so you can read this. Like, I've read that
You're
case.
Like, I literally decided it for you.
Like, okay, thank you.
Oh my gosh. See, it's funny because it's like, you're explaining that and I literally started sweating because I'm like, oh my God, this is so uncomfy. But at the same time, it's like, as an attorney, like there are going to be things that like make us feel some type of way.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, like it's our job to show up for our client.
Yeah.
So it's like we are still going to be respectful. We're still going to operate in a way that feels us, and that we can be proud of. But we're also going to not let ourselves become impacted enough to not show up for our client and what they deserve.
Yeah.
But we also need to understand what our boundaries are and the respect that we deserve as their advocate.
Yeah.
So you're kind of balancing that line of like, okay, I feel so uncomfortable right now that I'm having to be combative with you over something that like I know.
Yeah. And would you really pose that same question to a male attorney? Like sometimes I'm like, would they, or is it just because they think that I'm going to back down or maybe not stand up for my client and object? Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the fact that we go through that battle in our head within like a split second, it's just like, it's a lot to juggle.
Yes, it is. I think we were talking earlier, one of the big things I've learned is just doing a lot of depositions and doing a lot of very, depositions are confrontational. There's both sides argue sometimes and it can get a little intense, but I've just learned to be comfortable being uncomfortable. So there are times where defense counsel is going to object and you're going to start going back and forth, or maybe you go off the record and you need to argue about the way case law is interpreted, or maybe a question the way it was asked, or whether something's admissible or if it violates privacy. There's a ton of things. But you have to be comfortable being uncomfortable so that you don't just back down.
Absolutely.
And I know it's like, I know I get hot and I'm like, get flustered and red, but at the end of the day, that's our job. We can't back down because it's our client that we're defending and protecting. And so I think just being okay with those feelings of uncomfortableness and maybe feelings of anxiety or like, am I doing this right? And just not standing down. And I've had it too, where I've just sometimes will just call up one of the people on our the attorneys in our team. And I'll just be like, hey, I think this is what I need to do, but I'm like starting to second guess myself. Do you agree? And just having that voice of like confirmation sometimes is like, yes, okay.
Yes.
I thought that was the way, but like I just need that extra validation because it's getting pretty aggressive here, and I just want to make sure like I'm standing for the right thing.
Yes.
And so having allies, having just being okay feeling uncomfortable, like it's just part of the process, I think.
Yeah, I do too. And I think that honestly is where a lot of growth comes from, is the uncomfortability. You know, it's easy to kind of stagnate, stay in your comfort zone.
Yeah.
But the second you get out of that, you see what you're truly capable of.
Absolutely.
And I think that's huge. When it comes to a day that you've had that's heavy, you feel like you're not being respected, like how do you protect you at the end of the day? Like what do you do to kind of regroup, see your worth?
That's a good question. I think for me, it's just detaching. So at the end of the day, like our jobs are very stressful. And let's say I was in a deposition, 5-hour deposition, took a lot of hits, and it was a very intense deposition. After that deposition, I just need to decompress. I cannot just jump back into emails, and like I need to process everything that I felt, because during that deposition, I'm putting a bunch, like all my emotions on hold.
Absolutely.
And I'm like, okay, this is for later. But you're so focused in your deposition, like you're listening to every question, you're objecting, you're making sure certain testimony makes sense. And when you finish, I don't know about you, but like I leave exhausted.
I literally call it like being on call all day. Like it's like law school, it's the Socratic method, and you're sitting there and you're on call, but you're on call for like 5 to 8 hours of just being on. That's exhausting.
Even if you're on Zoom, I think Zoom sometimes is even more exhausting because you're just
Staring
on your
at a
little
screen.
You're like super tense.
Yeah.
And so so depositions are just the first example that comes to mind, but I will literally sometimes just go lay on my floor and just kind of like decompress. Go for a walk. Right now it's summer, so it's super hot. But I just lay on my floor with the AC on, and just kind of process everything. If it's one where I'm like very, like I've got too much going on, I'll just call someone and I'll be like, oh my goodness, this deposition was crazy.
Help me process this. Listen to me.
Like, have you ever seen this happen? Or have you ever heard these kinds of questions?
Yeah.
Because every deposition is so different. And sometimes you do get questions where you're like, what?
Yeah.
Like,
and it's like, I don't know how to respond to that because I've never heard that before. And now you're kind of just like, okay, now I have a plan of attack. But it's hard when like you're confronted with something you don't know, especially when we're very like type A people and like to be as prepared as possible. And it's like, I didn't prepare for this.
Can we take a 5-minute break? I need to I think for me, I'm so lucky that I have you and we work together, and I've found, Simon Law Groups brought me one of my closest friends, but not everyone has that. Yeah. And so I think you have to find a group of, one, if you're a female attorney, find other female attorneys that you can lean on for samples, for venting, for
questions you might be embarrassed to ask.
Also just for like, hey guys, like I've had a really rough week. Anyone else? Like, let's just go get some drinks or like go get some food, whatever.
Yeah.
But then also friends outside of the law, because what I've noticed is all day you're talking about the law, right? Yeah. And then once your off hours come on, if you still hang out with other attorneys, it just work like
inevitably comes up.
And you're married to an attorney, so it's even or almost married, but but it's very easy to just kind of like not turn off your brain, and sometimes you really just need to like switch it off.
Absolutely.
And sometimes you just gotta watch a good TV show, shut off your brain.
I love to just unplug. Yeah. Like I love unplugging like literally and also just like mentally. Like I just want to sit and not think for a second.
So do you just turn your phone off, or what do you do?
Yeah, I'll turn it on like do not disturb, just in case there's an emergency, someone can reach me. But usually if it's like in the other room or something, and I just literally like, I know that I'll start scrolling or I'll start doing things where it's like, that's not the kind of mindless I need right now. That's not going to make me feel better. So it's kind of just, checking in with yourself and like, what's going to make me feel good after this day? Is it, scrolling, or is it sitting and just like watching a show and getting lost in it, or reading a good book and just like engrossing?
Being like fully
immersed.
Yes.
Yeah.
Engrossing.
Right? I don't know if that would like, when you say a word and you're like, that doesn't sound right.
The worst is when you say something in deposition and you're just like, I'm just going to go with it.
Oh
because I can't second guess myself.
I literally will look up words before a deposition and have them be pronounced for me because I'm like, I will not mess this up.
Oh, yeah. No, you have to. Especially with like medical terms. Like, for me, before I used to like religiously after a deposition walk both my dogs.
Yep.
But now I have the baby. So during my like my breaks or when I know, like, for example, if I take a lunch break, I'll go play with her for a little bit, just kind of clear my mind and then process all the feelings and then jump back into it. But I think just finding something that brings you joy and that you can just shut off your brain for a little bit helps a lot.
So much. And it's important to constantly check in with yourself and know what makes you feel good.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, you cannot pour from an empty cup.
100%.
And I think like when you're in the industry of advocating for people or serving people or wanting to show up for people, pouring into yourself can be really difficult. Mm-hmm. But also like you can only be someone's best advocate when you're also doing that for yourself.
And I think that goes for all, it's not just being for female attorneys. It's like any industry.
Absolutely.
I think our careers are very demanding, but there's also other careers that are very demanding in other ways. And whether it be emotionally, physically, or just all kinds of things, finding that something to balance out the amount of work we have. Definitely.
Because at the end of the day, you're more than your profession. Like you're also an individual, you're a family member, you're a friend, you're all of these things that allow you to be better in your profession. And it's important to constantly water all of those other areas of your life too.
I agree. One thing that I've just always kind of done is I do talk about my personal life with opposing counsel. And I don't know if everyone does that, but for me, it's just like showing them like I'm a human being and like I have a life outside of work. And even just something as simple as like, oh yeah, do you mind if we push this deposition? I have my daughter's birthday party or I don't know, I have family in town or things like that. I think we need to get comfortable just being human beings and not just like always just putting up this wall with defense, because I think the more they know, they're also like, oh yeah, you know what? I actually have a vacation. Do you mind if we continue this deposition for another week?
Yeah. And then it doesn't allow for that space of like, are they just, like trying to push this, or are they doing gamemanship? And it's like, no, I literally just, I'm human. I have some things going on, so I think it eliminates them filling the gaps.
I agree. What about just I know you do a lot of motion work. When you've done motions to compel, for example, first thing that comes to my mind, because we're talking about it, arguing them. Have you had any situations where your opposing counsel is like calling you up and like arguing with you, or for the most part, has it been professional where they're just responding to your moving papers and that kind of situation?
My first instinct was to just be like, yes. Both. Both. I think I like to do it a lot over email and writing, because you have to make so many exhibits when you do motions that it's easier to just kind of have that paper trail. And I think sometimes when you have that paper trail, you can see like, we're really not gonna, like, we just see this very differently. So hopping on a call is probably gonna be combative. We're probably gonna be at a standstill because we both just view this position very differently. Like there's not going to be any kind of meeting of the minds here. But sometimes like when it's in the meet and confer stage, so before you get to drafting the motion, I will definitely hop on a call and be like, hey, can we just like hammer some of these out? Like I don't want to have to draft a motion with like 20 requests. Like, let's see if we can try and get this down to 10. Like what ones can we agree to? What is your hesitation on what this is asking? And like, can we tailor it to be more comfortable for you, know, like kind of trying to work, because at the end of the day, you want to be reasonable. Yeah. And so I think I've seen both. I usually prefer paper trails. especially when you know it's probably going to be a combative call. But it's worth a shot. But if you are on the phone and you're feeling like you're being talked all over, you're being walked all over, you're not being taken seriously, at the end of the day, I'd rather that be in an email than on a call.
Yeah. And I think the reason I bring it up is a lot of things can be resolved on the phone, but it's so hard when you've been ghosted and they're not answering your calls and they're not responding to your emails. And so at a certain point, you're just like, okay, I've done everything I can. I've been following up with you for months. And at this point, like, I'm sorry, we're just going to file our motion.
Yeah.
But I agree. I think there is a delicate balance because you don't want to burn a relationship, but at the same time, like, we have a job to do. And so it's hard.
It's a fun little balancing game.
Oh, geez.
I know. I think this is like really good for us to talk about. I think it's important to acknowledge and also think about steps on how things can change and be better. And I think also for everyone listening, like, it'd be awesome if you guys shared your stories, what you've experienced, things that you've seen where change has happened, or where you've been like, I really like the way that this person showed up in this moment. I think it'd be important for us to share and kind of build this community up where we can talk about these things and combat them together. I
love that. Yeah, please send us anything, things that you've experienced. I know anytime I see something that's within our like firm emails, I save the email or I save the response. And so I'd love to hear how other people have experienced things and maybe things that worked for them. But I think this is definitely a conversation that we'd like to revisit at some point because it's always happening. Things are always changing. So thanks for everyone that tuned in. We will catch you guys on the next episode.